I worked with Saturn for 13 months, intimately. Not that kind of intimately. Actually, it was 26 months all told. It was fascinating. So, pour a cup of tea, cuddle up, and let's unpack this. Over 2 years ago, I performed an epic, super involved return to sender spell. It was the largest ritual project I'd ever done to date, and I kept it actively working for 13 months afterward. One of the deities I called on for help with this grand redesign of my energy field was Saturn, or Kronos, or Shani if you're Hindu. And I know Saturn's not a common god to work with these days, but his superlative authority to put things right that have been wrong for a very long time inspired me to call on him. Well, the spell worked gangbusters, and after having Saturn's help for over 13 months, I felt it only fair that I should try to return the favor. The old gods appreciate sacrifice and gratitude, right? So I spent the next 13 months making offerings of gratitude every Saturday, because that's Saturn's Day. And these last 2 years have been a real journey for me. I'm going to start with a little recap of who Saturn is, because I know most folks haven't really worked with him, not intentionally, and there's a lot of misconception about Saturn. Then we'll talk about my own experiences with Saturn, which actually go back many years, and it was only through this transformative process that I discovered Saturn's long game influence in my life. As always, there will be timestamps in the description box if you'd prefer to jump around. Okay, let's get into a quick Real Housewives style recap of who Saturn is and how he fits into the cosmology, or Cronus. I keep using Saturn because that's the name I'm more familiar with, and that's what we call his planet now. But usually I reference the Greek names, so I guess deal with it? The mythology is all messy and generally inconsistent anyway. So in the mythology, Saturn, or Kronos, was a son of Earth, Gaia, and Sky, Uranus. And Uranus, in the way of many sky gods, was rather cruel and punitive, and his wife got tired of it and wanted to put him in his place. She hatched a plan to take him down a notch, and of all her offspring, only Saturn had the nerve or ambition to carry it out. When Uranus visited Gaia for a little co-ed naked bower wrestling, Saturn snuck in with a sickle and gelded his father. And in the logic of Greek mythology, this also meant Saturn was now in charge, and he banished his father to Tartarus. Saturn's subsequent rule over gods and men is known as the Golden Age, where everything was dandy and wonderful, and humans were not assholes. Saturn helped civilize early humans. He has an influence over the harvest, and he shared the secrets of winemaking. Which, honestly, makes Prometheus' gift of fire seem a little paltry, you know? Personal opinion. Perhaps it seems the story should end there, with gods and mortals living happily ever after, but family trauma will always catch up with you. And Saturn knew that one day, one of his children would usurp him the way he did his own father. Generational curses are a real So, every time his sister wife, Rhea, delivered a baby, he'd swallow it down. Yeah, like an oyster. Baby sushi. Understandably, Rhea's not into this parenting method, and when Zeus is born, she hides the baby and gives Saturn a swaddled stone instead, which he downs, gullibly. This part doesn't add up to me. I think some narrative context has been lost over time, but we'll go with it. So, he swallows a baby-sized stone. Years later, when Zeus grows up, he returns to free his siblings by forcing Saturn to vomit them up. I believe Rhea provided the expectorant, so again, we've got a frustrated, perhaps oppressed wife getting her revenge. Always a good story element. Somehow, this act of cunning by Zeus means he has now usurped his father's throne and, repeating the family drama, banishes Saturn to Tartarus. However, I guess Zeus and Saturn, or Cronus, eventually reconciled because healing these generational curses is important. So, in ancient Greece, Saturn continued as a patron of the harvest, and in later Rome, his temple housed the treasury, and every winter solstice week, the Romans partied hard for Saturnalia, drinking, remember the wine? Feasting and gift-giving in honor of Saturn. And yes, this is where we get Christmas from. Actually, our modern holiday is a confluence of ancient and medieval sources, but that's another discussion entirely. To simplify and perhaps agitate, the solstice is the reason for the season. And to this day, Saturn continues to hold sway over many elements of life, although we generally only discuss him in relation to astrology and his planetary influences. In broad strokes, Saturn is associated with wisdom, discipline, and he rules karma. In his outcomes, he moves famously slowly, but oh so surely. And when he shows up in your life, he will show you where you need growth. And in the case of your Saturn return, he's none too subtle about it. And this is where Saturn gets a bad rap for being cruel. It goes back to that nasty family history of swallowing up his own children. There's a famous painting. But I have some thoughts. Obviously, the cannibalistic image of a ragey, half-naked old man devouring babies tends to shut down the discussion. Yet, when Zeus arrives, full of youthful resentment, it turns out all his siblings are perfectly well, whole, and, in fact, have grown to adulthood in this time with all of their own godly powers intact. So, what happened? Saturn swallowed, but he never chewed? Something doesn't add up for me. And yeah, I realize that Greek myths are not to be taken as factual in any way. So, metaphorically, Saturn did not, in fact, eat his children in the sense of that horrifying painting. What he did do was hold them all close. Too close. Like, way too close. Like, he confined them so tightly, he halted their ability to engage with the world. In other words, Saturn simply committed the sin that so many parents of millennials committed. He helicopter parented them, to the point they can't do their own laundry when they first leave the house. Yeah, I said it. This bears out when we see the infantile way they collectively ruled the world for the next few thousand years. It gets messy, which is not to say that millennials are as ethically rudderless as the Greek pantheon. You guys are finding your way in a world that kicks your ass when you're not looking. But these gods had no such checks and balances on their unfamiliarity with how things actually work down here in the mud. So it's different. Don't come for me. I'm not calling anyone out. I'm merely pointing out that Saturn's reputation as unnaturally cruel is perhaps not so justified. In fact, I read something once that really helps in understanding how to approach Saturn on his unavoidable return. I'm sorry, I just don't remember the source at this point, but she said basically that Saturn is only to be feared by people who don't do their own work. And looking back on my own first and thus far only Saturn return, it makes so much sense. Because I was hit hard, but it was absolutely necessary to wake me up and shake me out of the nightmare of being complicit with my life as it was. Our first Saturn return happens when Saturn makes a full orbit back to where he was when we were first born. Saturn's transit takes from 27 to 30 years to complete. And somewhere in that time frame, we all just really go through it in one way or another. As a kid, Saturn was my favorite planet because those giant rings are so gloriously extra. By the time I was school age, We knew Uranus had rings too, but meh. They seemed pale and stubby compared to Saturn's. By my late 20s, I was still completely ignorant of astronomy, other than knowing I was a Gemini, but things happened anyway. And at late 27 or early 28, I saw Saturn's rings through a telescope for the first time. And that's my only time so far. Not perhaps terribly relevant, but I think the coincidence is cool. And that telescope viewing marked the advent of everything hitting the fan. On one hand, I was coming to realize that there was no going back to my faith, because once you discover the church is willfully lying to their members, it kind of cancels out everything else. Or it did for me. So, the entirety of my cosmology was collapsing around me. I was spiritually rudderless for the first time in my life. For me, that was a real crisis, and I wasn't handling it well. About the same time, I also came to terms with the fact that I had married a man who had zero interest in getting to know the real me. Like, at all. Like, I annoyed him unless I was actively fawning for him. Enter Saturn in his return. The more I pulled into myself and stopped worrying about my husband's emotional needs, since he clearly had no interest in my interiority, the more agitated and aggressive he started to get. I guess without me there constantly hovering to keep him calm, he didn't know how to manage his own emotions, or he just didn't want to. And getting irritated had in the past always worked to bring me to heel. In my mind, I thought he'd be relieved because I wasn't so needy as to constantly need him to be pleased with me. But of course, as we adults all recognize, what he was experiencing was the loss of his emotional support chattel. And it was very, very difficult for me to make the cognitive leap, or really tiny next logical step, that the only way forward was out. I was still thinking, I can fix this! And no, there was no we can fix this. We'd never had a meaningful conversation about anything. There was no partnership. I was deep into the middle of this turmoil by the January of my 29th year, and what to do about my miserable marriage was just about the only thing I could think about. I was walking across the park, spinning my wheels, as I had been for weeks and months, stressing about how to fix things. Looking down at the sidewalk as I went, I wasn't taking anything in from around me. I was stewing and machinating at full steam when abruptly I noticed a dead crow smack down right next to the sidewalk. It startled me from my mental fuming. I'd never been this close to a crow. I'm not sure I'd ever seen a dead one, but one thought came into my mind, and only one. It's dead. And I knew it wasn't the crow. This was the message, the sign I needed for clarity to pour in. Perhaps it's completely irrational to equate a rat-poisoned crow with the demise of my marriage, but it was the symbolic referent I needed in that moment to make everything calm and clear. There is no fixing a dead relationship. It's time to make a plan. And I did, and it was messy and terrifying and dangerous, but I did get out. I was moved out about a week after my 30th birthday. So yeah, you could say my first Saturn return was a bit of a doozy. I had no idea at the time, of course, that, like Odin, crows are precious to Saturn. I had no idea that I was at the time in my life when we get a big shakeup to show us what we need to fix. At the time, I just dealt with the complete disillusion of my marriage and my faith, and I tried to find a path to rebuild. So I think it's kind of fitting that 2 years ago, still largely ignorant of Saturn, I called on him to help me correct a lifelong problem. And he did. If you want to see the results of that ritual work, I did a video discussing my results last year, and I'll put a link to it in the description box should you be curious about that. And for that reason, I'm not going to go into detail about my year of working with Saturn and Sekhmet to reset my energy field. Spoiler? It worked! And by way of a thank you to these gods, for the subsequent 13 months, I performed weekly services of gratitude to them. Because one does not simply get a favor from the gods and then say, hey, thanks, peace out. So finally, what did I learn from serving Saturn for 13 months? Well, firstly, he moves slowly with Sekhmet, whom we'll discuss in a subsequent video. She was comparatively chatty with me right away. Anyway, she's a lot. But with Saturn, I did not sense a response from him for many weeks. I organized my house, getting rid of things no longer relevant or of use. I made offerings to the crows. I practiced grounding exercises. I meditated on Saturn regularly, and I learned what I could of Saturn. There's not really a lot out there. By week 5, I had learned that what happened at the end of my 20s was my first Saturn return. By week 7, he started to let me in. During my meditation that week, I was shown that the evolution our world is going through right now, this really slow shift into a kinder and more tolerable realm, you might call it returning to a golden age. And the impression I had was that Saturn is very involved in this process. After all, the so-called golden age of humanity was always his business. And so when we work in alignment with helping the world become a better place, we are, at least in that sense, in alignment with Saturn and his long-term plans. And if that's all a little out there for you, it might be useful to think of Saturn as a god who deals with shadow work, or parts work if you prefer that term. He is all about digging up the unexamined issues and exposing them to the light of day. This can be a living hell for anyone who acts maliciously or who doesn't do their interior work. But for me, it makes Saturn a liberator. He has been helping me shuck off the detritus that isn't really me. Yeah, and not fun exactly, but important and deeply satisfying. What I've come to see with Saturn is a grandfatherly energy. Not a cuddly, hanging out with the kids kind of grandfather. He's much cooler than that, more reserved. But those in his charge do not escape his eye. He is stable, consistent, and eternal. And although he may not work in our sense of a timely manner, what he produces is on a grand scale, and to us mortals, permanent. What I finally settled into with Saturn was a weekly meditative mantra session. I ruminated on Saturn while repeating a mantra for him 108 times. Slowly, through this process, I started to be more familiar with Saturn. By week 21, he showed me the tiniest snippet of my past life memories. I saw myself looking into the night sky and tracking Saturn, imploring him. Now, imploring him for what? I have no idea, but what I got from this memory was that I have some kind of much longer arc of having some kind of relationship with this deity. It put my experience into a span of many, many lives. So whatever my relationship with Saturn, his readiness to help me may be more about honoring many lifetimes of acknowledgement than just being there 2 years ago because this one weird mortal chick decided to ask. But I think this is an important point. We should call upon the gods we are most drawn to intuitively because there may be a reason we're drawn to them that goes much deeper than our current memories explain. This is something that I'm really coming to face at this point in my life. These deities I'm working with have come not just because I'm a really cool human, but because they're honoring plans and contracts and relationships that were forged long before this short little incarnation. It's both humbling and empowering. On week 24, during my meditation, Saturn asked me to have a celebratory libation with him after my mantras. Yeah, what? My first impression at the time was that we were celebrating some level up in our association. I guess I had passed some kind of initiatory period. I really don't know. All I can do is share with you what my little human brain was able to take from the interaction. Everyone's experiences working with deity are going to be unique. I'm not suggesting I'm downloading some kind of one-size-fits-all initiatory practice, but for me, that particular night was a meaningful experience. The next week, week 25, Saturn showed himself in my mind's eye, upending a big, heavy wooden table. Just fully laid table, dishes, offerings, what have you, all yeeted across the room. Clattering, splattering, total mess. For all he moves slowly, Saturn has a real flair for the dramatic. Honestly, bit of a queen. My impression from this display was that he was turning the tables in my favor. After that, I really didn't have any noteworthy appearances from Saturn. My mantras were accompanied by a sense of warmth, hominess, and familiarity. I settled into an awareness of Saturn as both a karma clearer and a dharma paver. And because this deity works with glacial timing, whatever changed when we shared a glass of wine and he flung the table over has yet to come to fruition. And it is my job to simply trust the process and work toward positive change in my life. However, as someone whose faith function necrosed out a few years ago, acting on faith is not something I have. So I guess the question is, can I trust that Saturn has set in motion a sea change in my life? I think I can, because when I look intuitively, I can sense the flow is different. There are resources now bobbing along the river of life that were not there before. So yes, I can trust the old gods. As the weeks passed, I continued my meditations and mantras, and yet my sense of familiarity with Saturn waned. It felt like he was drifting away until week 49, which felt like goodbye. He's off and on to other things. For the last few weeks, weeks 50 to 56, I've focused on expressing gratitude for his year of help and for the changes he's brought into my life, despite the lack of immediacy in their manifestation. After all, as I said, I can feel the water roiling. I must surmise that Saturn drew near, did me a solid favor for reasons I have yet to understand, and moved on to other things. What that favor was, I look forward to discovering whenever it manifests. I'll just have to trust that I'll recognize his hand in it when it does show up. And since I do my shadow work quite diligently, I look forward, when it does come, to my second Saturn return, because I'll be welcoming back a dear mentor of many eons. So, that is my experience working intimately with Saturn. 13 months of his help in retuning my energy field, and then 13 months of practiced gratitude to him. I don't think when I started with the gratitude that I expected anything from Saturn. I just wanted him to understand that I took his help seriously, and the connection, the interaction that followed was, well, it was an experience. One I am forever changed by. I'm really grateful for this transformative time in my life. And coming soon, we'll talk about my 13 months of gratitude with Sekhmet, because damn, it's a lot. So I hope you'll stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching, and until the next video, keep your deity work wild. What am I doing? Hey, you can't bump that, baby. You can't bump that one either. Super involved. We've got cars going by like crazy. Why the The only time I could film is like 3 in the morning, and even then it's like all drunk guys driving by hitting deer. It was put things right that have been wrong for a long, long time. You can't bump that. All yeeted across the room. Stop, stop, stop. To date. And more cars are going by. Or is that the furnace? And we can't stop the furnace because we will die. I'm wearing 5 layers of clothing and I'm freezing. It was only through this all of her offs and the next week, but we got a car going by.